Okay, so some people in this room, I think, will remember working on vector machines, right? But you and Rick Stevens, when the Sony PlayStation 2 came out, you saw something different you might be able to do with something like that. How do you think, what did you see, and how do you think that changed the landscape of computing?
So I was thinking before we started about, I feel like I should maybe start with like a one-word answer. So those of you who remember the old movie, The Graduate, where the one guy pulls Dustin Hoffman aside and says, I just have one word for you, plastics. I think the word for us is culture, because as technology change, culture change is probably the hardest thing that we do, embracing that new technology and knowing when to let go and in what time scale to do it. And most of us are geeks, and yet organizational psychology often may be the most valuable thing. But let me answer Melissa's question. So Rick and I were looking at the PlayStation 2. That itself should tell you we're geeks. And one of the things that we observed was the phenomenal price performance of the PlayStation 2 relative to anything you could buy, right? The emotion engine's effectively a vector processor. So I did something at NCSA that I knew wasn't going to make a big technical difference, but I did it because I thought it would drive conversation. I sourced 70 PS2s from eBay in Japan because you couldn't get the Linux kits in the US, and we built a Linux cluster. Now, it only had 10/100 Ethernet, so the bisection bandwidth was horrible. But a couple days later, John Markoff from the New York Times called, wrote a story about it called Computing on Toys. A couple days later, my phone rang and it was IBM, and they were working on what became the cell processor that ultimately wound up in Los Alamos Roadrunner. And a few years later, I found myself chairing the Go-No-Go committee about whether it was time to build a GPU-accelerated petascale machine. So can't claim credit for how that happened, but it's an interesting set of stories. But I will say one thing that, apropos the conversation this morning, I distinctly remember at that transition talking about the fact that as we're looking at that hybrid architecture, it was really important that we not view the cell as the first and only a one of about accelerators, that we needed abstraction libraries that would allow a whole series of generations to build software that was portable across that. 20 years later, we're still struggling to do that, right? So how we think about portability of code, when we let go of vectors, and in some sense we've come back to vectors in a different way with GPU accelerators, but understanding what changes and what doesn't. We're struggling with the same things around mixed precision right now in AI hardware, and we could talk some more about that later. But that's kind of the answer to that story. It's follow the dots and see where there are inflection points. And remember, you got to work at multiple time scales. Most of the time, we have our head down, focused on the here and now. How do we optimize codes? What do we do for next procurement? How would you think about what's next? There's a mid-scale where you have to think about there are going to be inflection points, but there's also the really long-term R&D where you have to say, odds are on a 10 or 20-year time scale, what we're doing now is not going to be what we're doing. Know when to make those transitions and when to support investment at all of those time scales.
That was a lot.
It was a lot. I got that off my chest. Okay.
All right, you feel better now. What about computing in oil and gas? So things have changed a lot since those early parallel machines. Are you involved in this industry with all these people? I mean, not with all of these people, but generally.
Well, you're all my friends.
If you weren't, you are now.
So the very first, it's another funny story. So the very first job I was offered out of graduate school was Exxon approached me about hiring them to build a custom machine for reservoir modeling. That was 40 years ago. I say that only to say that one of the things that I think has long been true is that the oil and gas industry, besides the national security business, has been probably the primary technology driver of high-performance computing. And that's still true. And so part of what I was saying about timescales is that balance of when you are buying the next generation and when you're trying to step off and shape the new technology. So we're at the mercy of the AI market. Addison talked about that. And We've gone from a world where we're driving the bus to in the world of killer micros. We're riding the bus and we could talk to the driver and suggest some directions they might go. In the AI world, we're hoping they'll drive past our neighborhood, right? But we're riding in the back of the bus. So given that reality, what can we do and where there are opportunities for semi-customization? So I think there are opportunities to think about semi-custom chiplets and being able to design domain-specific accelerators. That's a hybrid path between being at the mercy of what else is happening and fully custom machines. But we need the mechanisms and the support to be able to explore those possibilities. But that's my best guess about how we regain some control over our own future.
That was going to be my next question.
How do we get control?
How do we adapt to the next thing? As we've said a couple times in this room, Dan Stanzione said it yesterday, other people have said, you don't necessarily need AI for HPC, but you need HPC to do AI. Are we headed for AI everything? And then as we do that, how do we adapt to it? We've had that conversation in this room multiple times.
So in the near term, the answer is probably yes. But I will hasten to point out that when people today say AI, they're talking about a very small subset of AI. They're talking about generative AI, the whole rich history of AI that is totally different. You want to think about knowledge representation, think about qualitative reasoning. Those are just two of many different parts of AI that aren't here. So we're really focused on a very small subset of deep learning, and it's had some phenomenal results. But keep that in mind. And the whole talk about energy, right? And hundreds of megawatts and collectively billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in AI investment infrastructure. I just remind you that when you go back to wherever you're staying tonight, look in the mirror. We have an existence proof that you can do AI for about 20 watts, right? There are other models out there, and so one of my other beliefs is we have to learn some things from biology about how we design intelligent machines. That's one of those longer R&D enterprises. In the near term, yeah, we're mostly at the mercy of the hyperscalers in the AI market, but the way we get leverage, as I said, is maybe think about in a multi-chip world, how we might be able to do some semi-custom chiplets for domain specialization. The trick is how you leverage that ecosystem to make the economics work. And there's some great work done by some friends of all of ours at MIT that look at the economics of, everybody who built custom machines over the last 30 years failed, right? Why would it be different now? Part of it is because the economics have changed, right? And so, I wrote a piece a few years ago about follow the money, and you gotta follow the money. But if you can make the math work based on the number of copies and the ROI, it's still worth thinking about, and there are some opportunities. Because the other problem that the custom machines had was you had to build a complete ecosystem. There is an opportunity, I think, with chiplets to just build a small piece and leverage most of the rich software and hardware ecosystem that's already there. So it's how do you get maximal leverage? To me, that's probably our best near-term opportunity.
So as we're waiting, turn my thing back on. Okay. So as we're waiting for that AI bus to come by, what if the quantum bus comes instead? Do we all get on the quantum bus? Is that going to solve our problems? Or are we going to go on that way instead?
Well, there's an old saw in science that says the best way to have a good idea is to have a lot of ideas. So I do think that there will be a role for quantum. Full disclosure, when I was at Microsoft, I owned Microsoft's quantum project, and you probably saw it in the news, right, the last week, the announcement. And when I first took it over, I approached Michael Friedman, who was the head of the project, a Fields Medal winner, and I said, Michael, I just want to make sure I understand. We're going to try to design a quantum computer around a physics phenomenon that's not yet been experimentally verified. Did I have that right? And he's like, yep, you got it. I'm like, okay, all right, just want to understand what the ground rules of what we were trying to do were. And there's still some open questions about that verification, but that's a conversation for another day. Here's what I believe about quantum. This is a one man's opinion and may be wrong. I think I would view quantum as a special purpose accelerator. I don't see it as a general purpose replacement. If we solve the stability and reliability problems to create enough logical qubits to make it viable for reasonable problems, then I think the issue is going to be it's potentially useful for compute-rich, data-poor problems, right? I mean, the old life, the universe, and everything, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the answer is 42, right? You compute forever. So it's not great for data assimilation because that transition from, ambient to millikelvins, that is a huge technological problem. So my bias is I think something will happen. We have to keep making bets, but it's probably a special purpose accelerator. We're going to need a bunch of those, I think. And so in some ways, if you look at the history of the last 50 years, we've gone from heterogeneity in computing, right? Remember the bunch before an IBM and the bunch to everything was x86. And we're seeing some diversification again as the hyperscalers are seeing the economic value of building custom hardware. And we're seeing it in the smartphone ecosystem as well. I think we'll see some more diversification as well. But again, the money's got to work. And that's the other thing that's changed in our world. When Seymour was alive and we were buying Craze, 50 million was a lot of money. You could shape the future of advanced computing with 50 million. Now you need to think 50 billion if you're going to shape the future of the technology. And not many people have that many poker chips to sit down at the table.
Some of the places that you have supported do have those poker chips, right? The national labs, the federal agencies. So after you've worked in all of these places and worked as advisors to presidents, and what are some of the most valuable projects that you participated in? What did you take away from those experiences that people can learn from?
You can just plain be wrong. You can also be right too early, which is almost as bad, maybe worse than being wrong. So I built one of the first ARM servers at Microsoft as part of a Skunkworks project. Took it to the leadership. I can't repeat in polite company what the reaction initially was, but I'm like, low power ARM is going to be one of our futures. And it is now, but that was, 20 years ago. I was proud of when I was at NCSA bringing the first terascale x86 clusters into broad use. I bet on Itanium. Boy, was I wrong about that. And so I was proud of how the TeraGrid evolved. I was proud of bringing cloud computing into academic research. I did the first deal with NSF to make cloud cycles available for academic research because I thought this is a new paradigm and we need to think about different alternatives. Because after all, some of us are technologists, but most of us, computing is not the end, it's a means. And so you want to look for the most efficacious means to solve your problem that you can. Sometimes it's computing, but it's not always. And so that, I think, is also the thing to think about is, there's a reason why we do experiments, right? And sometimes that is the most cost-effective way to do it. Sometimes it's neither politically, nor scientifically, nor practically possible, and computational modeling is important, as is theory. And so choose your weapons wisely and appropriately. But those are a couple things that I'm personally proud of.
Yeah. So I don't know how many people saw this, but last week, you and a few other well-known names in the HPC space published a science policy article in Science magazine about the US's lack of planning for future HPC. So would you give us a quick overview of the article and talk a little bit about the value of collaboration between industry and academia and the national labs?
So part of that was an outgrowth of several studies that those of us who wrote the piece, and if you go to my blog, www.hpcdan.org, you can read about it. We did several studies, National Academy studies, Department of Energy studies. Bruce Hendrickson from Livermore did a SIAM-based study, and they all basically said a version of the same thing. We're not paying enough attention to workforce issues. We talked some about that, both numbers and diversity. What we're doing ain't working anymore, right? In the sense that the price of our machines has become exorbitant at the leading end, and we're no longer driving the bus. So how do we embrace this brave new world where we're not driving the future of computing in the way that we did in the past? And what we made a plea for, and we enumerated some examples of where we know, all of us in modeling know that's problematic. The dirty little secret that memory bandwidth hasn't kept pace with floating point rates. And yeah, HBM is in some sense an attempt to recover maybe some of what the old craze had with interleaved SRAM memory that could deliver 4 words per cycle and actually support DAXB operations at a high utilization. We're lucky if we can do that with cache-based systems today, right? And that's an example of the commercial market going a perfectly reasonable way, but not one that meets a lot of traditional HPC needs. The low precision drive of AI, you know, what happens if we wake up in a world and find out that, yeah, we got lots of 8-bit units and a legacy low performance 64-bit floating point processor in our hardware, because that's what the market actually said it wanted. Now, I don't actually think that will happen, but that whole notion of the drive for low precision, because that supports generative AI very well, that notion that we've got to reclaim some of the thought leadership in driving these things. So what the piece calls for fundamentally is, and it's framed in some context, and if you haven't read Addison's piece in HPC Wire, you ought to go do it. He posed 5 questions. It's a really great summary. It's tied up in geopolitical, global competition, right? I mean, it's the whole issue of what Europe, the US does vis-a-vis China and the old Eastern Bloc. There were deep political issues there that are driving global trade dynamics, and whatever you think about what's going on in Washington, there are real issues that are afoot there. Whoever owns the high ground in advanced technologies will surely dictate the direction of the 21st century economy and all of the consequent global leadership things that go with it. So this is not just geeks talking about technology. It has broad and deep ramifications for, if you will, global leadership in the rest of the century. And so what we called for was an all-of-nation response, an integrated public sector, private sector, and academic partnership to look at some of these problems and pursue some strategies at a scale that we're going to have to, as I said at the end of my piece, we're not talking a few millions here or there. We're talking billions sustained over a decade or more if we're going to drive a change. And billions is not 1 or 2, it's probably 100, right, if we're really going to think about this. And I'm worried, frankly, that we are, by lack of strategy, we're going to lose what we have viewed as a birthright. And it ain't no birthright, folks. We got it by a combination of accidents of history and strategic investment. And we can lose it just as easily. Now, against that, there is the rightful desired approach. Scientific discovery is a global enterprise, and so there is a judicious balance between openness and collaboration and welcoming talent, but also protecting national interests. And it's a delicate line to walk there. And the truth is, we will lose if we engage, in my judgment, entirely in US protectionism. Part of what made us a global science and technology leader was the best and brightest talent on the planet wanted to come to this country. If that stops being true, we're toast.
Well, that's a happy thought.
So get out there and act.
Yeah. So as we are trying not to be toast, as we are looking to the future, what kind of collaborations can you see for us, for academics, for industry, for national labs? We've got a whole bunch of industry in here. We're here at Rice University, so we've got some collaborations going. There's some national labs people here. How do we sort of build that back to where we should be?
So I think one of the things that we have to do is break down some of the artificial barriers for collaboration. Some of them, are reasonable. I mean, there are antitrust reasons why certain barriers exist, and those are appropriate. But it is hard, and I've been on both sides of trying to do technology deals. I tried to do academic deals when I was at Microsoft, and I certainly had a long history of commercial collaborations when I was in academia. Those are god-awful, painful, bureaucratic messes to make happen. It's got to be much simpler, because it is simpler in some other parts of the world. We need to let talent flow nimbly back and forth across those boundaries so that collaboration can take place in some new ways. I think the other thing we've got to do is energize a new generation about why science and technology is so exciting. You know, during COVID, I had a T-shirt, which some political circles I was afraid to wear. It said, "Science, it's like magic, but it's real." And that excitement, one of the things I called for in the last testimony I did to Congress when I was chair of the Science Board was I called for a National Defense and Education Act 2.0. Now, those of us who are older in this room remember the space race. And yeah, it was a Cold War competition between the US and the old Soviet Union. But there was a time when every kid dreamed about being an astronaut. Science was cool, as cool as it ever was, and we've lost that. And we need to rekindle that notion, because we need all of the talent that this country and the people who want to come here to be part of that. So how we improve our K-12 education system, energize more people about why science, it's the most amazing thing you can do. Nature is wily, but if you ask careful questions, it will give up its secrets. And that's what drives the future forward. But we've got to build a bigger talent base. We've got to lower some of those barriers to collaboration. And we have to play to the strengths of what each group does. Some things government is the primary driver of. But if it gets in the way of the private sector, it's a hindrance to progress. There's some things that private sector making money is the most powerful incentive mechanism there is. And you need to let it have free rein. But it needs to have checks on some of the social dynamics and needs as well. So that whole of nation notion and how we energize talent has to be driven by, you know, I'll end with this after I've blathered on. If you're a science fiction reader, Neil Stephenson is one of my favorite recent writers, and he has a line that I sometimes quote. He says, "If you want a better future, you got to start with better dreams." And we have to believe that the future can be better than the present, and I do believe it can, but the future doesn't just happen. We make the future. And we make the future based on the quality, the scale, and the scope of our dreams. That's what we've got to go out and energize a new generation about. It can't just be us old folks. Some of you are younger. You are the future. And the future is pregnant with possibilities. We just have to give you the tools and the resources to go make those dreams real.
Well, that was super inspirational.
What's better
Thank you,
than
I like
we're
that.
toast, right?
That's exactly what I was going to say. Great. So, okay, anything I have missed before we open the space for questions? Anything else you wanted to get across?
Let's see. I think I've talked about.
You made a long list.
Yeah, I did. Well, I mentioned culture. The only thing I would say about AI, and you know, those of us who grew up in a traditional computational science modeling world where the world began and ended with discretizing and solving time-dependent PDEs, right? That was what we did. You know, AI is, and that's in some sense a deductive approach that draws on hundreds of years of science. AI is more of an inductive approach. It's like, here's data. I'm going to construct a model from it. And there's a culture war between those two things. The one thing I wanted to inject was a comment from the statistician George Box, who said, all models are wrong. Some models are useful. And the trick with using any AI surrogate model is understanding its domain of applicability, right? If you press it outside its domain, garbage in, garbage out. And so understanding where it works, it can be a really powerful advantage to accelerate simulations. And The Shell talk this morning was a great example of that. So understanding that interplay, I think, is the opportunity. So AI it really is a huge opportunity for computational modeling, but it brings the economic dynamics that we're talking about, as well as understanding when you can trust the model, right? Okay, that was the last thing I wanted to say, I think. How's that?
That sounds great. Questions? There's at least one mic run around the room if anybody has questions for Dan.
Oh, come on. Someone's got a question or comment.
Thank you very much for the session. Very interesting and inspiring, as you've mentioned. I've heard during a few sessions here some kind of personification of AI, right? So AI is something. Why don't we ask AI? Let's consult AI. I see it as a tool, right? And you've kind of just mentioned and compared to our PDE, time-space solutions. It is a tool. And as a tool, we need to identify the problem and that we need for which we need that tool, right? So there must be, if not limits, at least applications. What is that limit? Do we see something on that? Because as a reservoir engineer, for me, it's been challenging to understand and to trust those types of model based on data, leaving my PDAs behind. So recently, and after that conference, I've been thinking more of maybe a hybrid solution, as we've seen some presentations also. Mm-hmm. Could you please comment on that, AI as a tool, limits, problems, and do we have limits? I mean, in the future, what do we expect from AI? Is it going to be solving everything?
Well, again, I think it depends on what you mean by AI, right? You know, if you go back and look at some of the old Feynman lectures, right, and he did some public lectures, not just the physics lectures. There's one that I've always loved where he says, you know, what do you do when you don't know what's happening? You guess. And if you listen to the audio really carefully, and it's an old black and white, you can actually hear the audience gasp when he says guess. Because what he means is, I have a hunch, right? And I'm going to go try it, and, you know, he also said, you know, no matter how beautiful your theory is, if it doesn't agree with the data, it's just wrong, right? So that, I think part of why we struggle with AI, and I was saying this to Melissa earlier today, we're not particularly challenged by a backhoe challenging our physical ability, right? But AI challenges emotionally something that is intrinsic to what we think of as our humanity, right? And I think we have emotional struggles sometimes with that. My personal belief is the fad over generative AI is going to die out. It's an amazing advance, but what we understand more generally about intelligence, this is a pretty small piece of it. You know, we're a long way from, notwithstanding all the hype in my judgment, from, you know, generalized artificial intelligence, right? I'm not worried about HAL appearing anytime soon. This is why I think more biology research is really important to understand the biological nature of intelligence, because it's probably the only real existence proof we have. But the broader, maybe more narrow technical answer to your question, I think, is how we think about understanding what the model approximates, because it is a constructed inductive model from a set of data. And so I've been involved, for example, in conversations about the distinction between weather forecasting and climate modeling, right? So weather forecasting, you know, multiple groups, Google, Chinese models as well, have built really accurate AI-based 7-day weather forecast models, which are as good or better based on statistics as their traditional PDE models are. But they're predicated on a model within a known operating domain, right? So climate change takes you outside the known operating domain. And then you get into the question about where, and I'm way over my skis in terms of my expertise in climate change modeling right now. In fact, maybe way past the edge of my skis. But that's an example of an active debate about, is this, how far can you push this? Because rare or new phenomena that the model never saw before, by definition, it's not likely to ever predict. So you're going to see some variation of things that have happened before, because that's what it was trained to recognize. And of course, you know, the old jokes about AI identifying features and images that were below our visual acuity to recognize, you know, pixel artifacts, and those being its discriminator. Those are the stupid things that can happen to you if you don't understand how the model works. I guess the last thing I would say that goes back to next generation science is, because so much of our future depends on science and technology, I worry a lot that most of our society is actually science and math averse. In order to have healthy debates about where technology it's appropriate to use it or not, you have to have some basic understanding about how the technology and the science works. Otherwise, it just looks like magic, right? And so that informed and thoughtful debate is really important. I think it's one of the reasons why those of us in the science and technology business have to be willing to engage the public. And yeah, we'll get some arrows for that, as anybody who's engaged in that space knows. But you have to explain it in a way that people can appreciate, yeah, it's not magic. It has applicability in places, and other places it doesn't. And then you can talk about what you might societally think is appropriate to do with it. But that requires an engagement. And that's a long-winded answer around multiple things. Sorry.
Thank you.
There was a myth growing up, I was going to date myself, but some crazy guy put PlayStations together and made a supercomputer out of it, and we all thought it was lies. So seeing you face to face is hilarious right now, so thank you for that. But yeah, right? Yeah, right. So I texted my brother, and he's like, seriously? So thank you for being here. No, my question is honestly, where do you see Gen AI in education as we move forward? What are we going to be looking at with students coming out? With Gen AI being this generation's calculator. You know, you used to always hear you're never going to have a calculator in your pocket. Everybody does now.
Yeah, well, I'm old enough to have used a slide rule, so yeah, there's that too. No, I think education is struggling with that, honestly, right now. In the same way that we struggled with the way that mechanization and automation disrupted certain economic sectors, and how we would, and the time scale in which that happened is also accelerating. And that's another problem that, you know, humans are pretty good at adapting to change on a generational basis. In fact, you know, there's an old line that, you know, new ideas take hold because old scientists die, and it's truer than we'd like to admit. But when change happens every year or two, humans are horrible at that kind of adaptation, because it requires rational debate as opposed to kind of an emotional social response. You know, I think we're going to have to embrace it in education as another tool. And some of this is going to, I think, and this is one man's opinion, and that's probably won't even get you a cup of coffee, but I think deciding what the essential skills are, that changes every generation to some extent, right? When automobiles first appeared, if you weren't rich or you couldn't repair one, you probably shouldn't own one, right? And now none of us ever looks under the hood of our car, right? So some skills atrophy because they're just not needed anymore, but they get replaced by new skills. So if you'd asked me 3 years ago, would prompt engineering be a topic to study? I would have. But it is an uneasy debate, and I think part of it is because it threatens people's livelihood. So I said to a group of deans a while back, you know, the truth is ChatGPT writes better than most of our undergraduates ever will. Not better than our best undergraduates can write, and I love writing, but better than our average to mediocre students can. So what does that mean for how we teach communication? I don't know the answer to that, but those are the kinds of conversations I think we need to have. If you look at what's happened in so many domains, people with elite skills, they're still very highly remunerated, and they always have been. Just because we can make stuff, we pay artists and craftspeople a huge premium for high quality, unique things. How that's going to evolve here, I don't know, but because it threatens so much of what we think of as innately human skills, it's a deep kind of emotional reaction. But we will adapt, and we'll look back and be amazed that people did stuff without AI tools. It may take a couple decades, but it's going to happen.
Okay, last question, Addison.
Hi, thanks very much. This is an excellent talk. Thank you for the well-structured interview as well. I love that you hearken back to the space race and science is cool, and there was a lot of nationalism involved in that. We talked about Cold War as another time when there was a lot of national investment. The difference between that and the current sense of AI nationalism is that with the current U.S. administration, it's one that is not so government focused. It's going to prefer private sector investment to government-based investment. So my question is, what do you think the implications are of having the critical technologies more in private sector hands versus public sector hands, which is the key difference between this AI nationalism war versus the prior examples?
It's a good question. The other thing that I think is different is in the old Cold War era, the East and Western Bloc economies were essentially separate. They're deeply intertwined now, right? We're a global ecosystem. In a trade war with China, to be blunt, will hurt both of us, right? You can debate how much, but it'll hurt both economies badly if that were to happen. But I think it's part of the reason why I think government has a critical role to play. And any of you who work for a multinational company, and there are a bunch of you in the room, there were times when I was at Microsoft that I looked at my blue Microsoft badge and I looked at my blue US passport and I said, the objectives of these are not exactly aligned, right? I mean, it wasn't like we were doing anything illegal, but my day job was to maximize corporate profits. That might not be in the long-term best interest of the United States, even though everything we were doing was legal. At least to my knowledge. That's the risk, right? The private sector, it's in the money-making business, right? That is its reward, and the markets reward it or punish it every single day based on that. The role of governments is to do things that the private sector lacks the incentives to do. One of those historically has been invest in long-term R&D. Because I think the only way that you win in the innovation race is you outcompete, right? Susie over there has preached that gospel for a long time. And that means you have to invest in the future. It means investing in people, the education system, the R&D that goes with that, and then the serendipitous miracles fall out that become trillion-dollar companies, but you can't predict where that's going to happen. If we starve that, we might win in the near term, but we will not win in the long term, because talent is the underlying thing that drives the success of any culture, right? I mean, if we've seen that in wars, I mean, you can destroy the physical infrastructure, but if the culture is intact, the talented people, the knowledge, it'll rebound quickly, right? If you decimate the culture, then you really have destroyed things. So this is the thing I believe we have to do. That's why I was talking about an NDEA 2.0, reinvesting in R&D and education at a scale that would be transformative. Now, what I don't know is how to sell that, because I spent a lot of time walking the halls of Congress talking about this. And if I've learned anything in DC and in Beijing and in Brussels, and I spent a lot of time there too, it is that what sells is fear. Hope doesn't motivate action among governments at the highest level. Fear does. It pains me to say that, but it's true. And so you got to figure out a positive way to play on the fear. That's the best strategy I know of. And that's why I was talking about investing in the future and who drives the future of the 21st century economy. I think losing that leadership, that's the fear. But the truth is, if it lies with the private sector, it's going to rightly maximize monetary gains, and more importantly, it'll maximize near-term monetary gains, right? Because it's the only companies I've ever seen that can afford to take a 20-year horizons are ones that have either de facto or literally quasi-monopolies in their business sector, right? Because otherwise you don't have the free cash to invest in curiosity-driven R&D. And there aren't many companies like that in any sector, right? Those of you in the oil and gas business, you know who they are, right? You could count them on one hand and have fingers left, right? And it's true in the technology business as well.
Thank you.
Okay, let's thank Dan for his time.